This is Spirit in Motion.
I'll be 40 this year. We were telling Chloe, who's recording us right now, we were telling her just like, I don't remember living. Like, I don't remember any other year being like this. I've been around for 40 years.
Yeah.
This is like 2020, when you look at it, you're like, this is insanity.
Right.
I was told when I became a Christian, which was very young, that life was going to be really easy for me.
Really?
And so I would like to know who is responsible for this. No, but that was like, so I grew up charismatic, and the thing was, if you're following Christ,
right,
it's going to be easy. And if it's not easy, it's because you're in sin.
Oh, wow. Or maybe better, like life's at least going to be better.
Life's going to be better, and if it's not, there's sin in the camp. That is a phrase from the Bible that people use all the time.
Right.
But that was the thing, right? Like,
yeah.
If something wasn't going well, there's sin in the camp. We don't know what it was, but obviously.
Yeah. And maybe it flows out of kind of a true thought, which is the idea that God is good, mm-hmm, and that God wants good things for you. So not wrong and not untrue. Down through history, people who, believed in God or whatever, or gods or other gods or whatever. I mean, you have very capricious gods who could one day feel this way and another day, be like this. Maybe moody, that sort of God. And then we see in Jesus and all of these good things that Jesus does and the kind of person that Jesus is. And so the idea that God is a good God is an important thought. And I think even in reaction to that was another idea, which was that anything and everything that happens to you must be from God. Mm. So it's kind of this sort of all-encompassing view of the sovereignty of God, which would be basically that God's in control of everything, and God is kind of behind the scenes making everything happen. And by the way, there's some, really thoughtful, smart people, smarter than me, who take that view of God. It's basically a view called strict determinism, which basically asserts that everything that happens, including evil, is God is behind it. And there's a lot of, like we could get into the discussion of all of that and where that goes and what that means. But there are different views on basically the sovereignty of God. So the sovereignty of God is kind of the question of like, what exactly is God in control of? What is he doing? What is he aware of? What is he causing? And so where I would come down on that, and I think where a lot of people would come down on that, is leaning much more towards what's called free will, meaning that human beings have a free will. And God allows us to make choices that aren't necessarily his choices or his desire. And then those choices have consequences, right? I think one of the best ways to kind of understand the sovereignty of God is to think of it like a giant cruise ship. And you've got all these people on a cruise ship, multiple levels, restaurants, shows, all of this. If you've ever been on a cruise, I haven't, but if you've ever been on a cruise, and I can imagine how it is, I mean, you've got some freedom on that cruise, and you can kind of do what you want to do. However, the ship is still headed to where the ship is heading to. And I think maybe that's a helpful way to think about how sort of the sovereignty of God works. There is your free will, but then there's also God's will and where God is leading and taking things. But in that kind of idea of free will is a response to the idea that God's in control of everything. And so if God's in control of everything, I think the way that it goes is if bad things are happening to you, well, then it must be God. So out of that kind of emerged this idea that no, God is a good God and God is for you. And I think out of that kind of came sort of the next natural conclusion, which is, well, if God is for me, then God probably wants what I want, right? And so that's so easy to do, isn't it? Like conflate our perspective on what would be best for us with surely this must be what God's perspective is and what God would want for us. And so I think we kind of confuse those two ideas.
I mean, it piggybacks off of sort of the biggest skepticism about God, that if there is a God,
he wouldn't allow
there to be hunger or pain or
right,
poverty that infests third world countries,
right,
or even within our own country. And what is the argument there?
Oh, wow. Like for that, or how do I respond to that?
Yeah, how do you respond to it? I think the argument for it is it's pretty out there. It's like the first thing that people will say if they
right,
are on a journey to be agnostic or atheist. But what is the response to that?
I think it's a complex response, and it's, I think, something that, Christians and even deeply faithful Christians over the years have had to wrestle with and come to grips with. I think ultimately the answer is that God wants free will, and so He allows human suffering as the outflow of our choices. There is a day coming where justice will be served and things will be put right. I think it's also hard for us to understand evil because we are so connected and defined by time and our time on earth. So we see our lives here as kind of the totality of everything that we're aware of. It's not kind of, it is. I think maybe a helpful way to think about it is if you think of it like a cake, in a circle, if you're going to cut that cake into 4 slices, each of those slices are going to be really big. Like that's a big slice of cake. But if you were going to cut it into 30 slices, those slices are going to be really thin. When we think about our life, I think the question is, what slice of our existence is this life? And I think if we understood that we're eternal beings and that this life is really just a drop in the bucket of our eternal existence, then maybe suffering might take on a little bit different perspective. It would be a momentary experience, not something to make light of, but it's not everything.
When I was a kid, when someone would say something to me like in opposition to the church or just believing in Jesus, I felt like I always had to have like this solid answer, and maybe right. In my mind I'm playing out the conversation in my head, and it's like, oh yeah, well, you didn't think about this, and then they shut up and they don't say anything anymore. The older I've gotten, the more I've learned in a relationship with Jesus, I don't have all the answers,
right?
And it's okay and safe to be able to wrestle with some of these things.
Well, absolutely. And I think even the call of Jesus to the original disciples is the same call to us today. So it's follow me, right? That's the first thing that He said. Follow me. They had no idea where they were going, and neither do we. Hebrews 11:8 talks about Abraham, the first guy that God really called and had deep relationship with. Hebrews 11:8 just says that by faith Abraham, when called by God to go to a land that he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he didn't know where he was going. And Abraham is kind of given as this type or model for faith. What does that mean? It means like this is what following God looks like. It means journeying into the unknown. When the disciples said, okay, Jesus will follow you, they had no idea. And the way that I know that none of them had any idea is that none of them were waiting at the tomb on Resurrection Sunday, counting down backwards from 10, 9, 8, here comes the earthquake, there's the angels. No one was waiting. In fact, we read that the Jesus movement was falling apart. The disciples were leaving. We get the account of 2 disciples on what's called the road to Emmaus who are basically brokenhearted, walking away. Their rabbi, their potential Messiah, has been crucified. As far as they can tell, no messianic figure was ever supposed to be crucified or defeated by the Romans. He was actually supposed to be the one doing the ruling and the defeating. They're puzzled how all this could happen. But anyway, my point in all of that is just that they did not know, and they had no clue what was coming. And I think the same thing's true for us. Even though we know more of who Jesus is, still the journey of following Him means the journey of following Him into the unknown. And that means there's going to be places where it's like, you're not going to have answers, and times where you're going to go, I don't understand, and I can't figure this out. I have these, like even as a pastor, people think that somehow maybe I'm completely settled in my heart. Yeah, I believe in Jesus. Absolutely. Does that mean I don't have my doubts from time to time? Nope. Because I do. There are questions that pop into my mind and things that I have to wrestle through and thoughts that I wonder about and things that I ask God about. It's just like, I don't have the answer to everything.
When you are doubting, what do you do?
I'm usually pretty patient with it. I've learned not to just overreact and go, all right, I'm done. I just think, well, let me put that away for now and see if an answer emerges, as I talk to God, as I continue to read. What's interesting is a lot of the things that bothered me when I was younger, I have a lot better understanding and answers of now. So the more I seek God, the more I read, the more I understand, the less I am affected and impacted by those things.
I want to say this just for clarity, and then you tell me if I'm off here, but growing up a Christian, it felt like you weren't allowed to question things.
Yeah.
Especially if a man or a woman of God,
Right.
which would be a preacher or someone who felt holier than thou, said something.
Right.
Because of that, a lot of things that I heard growing up became very foundational that my thinking and my life were built on. The older I got, and with the introduction of more voices in my life with the internet, the more those things begin to shake.
Right.
And my initial response was anger. Even when I got married, things that Diana believed that were very different than what I believed, just would end in a huge fight.
Yeah.
Because at the core of it, you're pushing on my belief.
And kind of and your identity, really, because you've built your whole life on this stuff.
Oh yes.
And then it's like when it starts to crumble, there's anger, which is really a reaction driven by fear.
Totally.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I don't really want to face it. I know all that feeling. Yeah.
Yeah. What do I do if I'm in that place? What am I doing with that? Who am I surrounding myself with? And how am I navigating some of those new questions that are touching on my identity? How did you do it?
I think for me, it's broadening the scope of the voices that you're listening to and reading. And what I mean by that is just there's some really great Christian thinkers out there.
Yeah.
And there's some really great non-Christian thinkers out there. And when you start to read broadly across, a variety of authors and thinkers, I think one of the worst things you can do is just align yourself with one person and go, you're the one, you can teach me everything. It's kind of a house of cards. As soon as one part of the foundation gets shaken, the whole thing starts to crumble pretty quickly. And I think a lot of people especially a lot of young people, like that's how they've grown up. Yeah. Well, the Bible is true. The Bible is true. The Bible is true. But don't ask questions. The Bible is true. And then they go to college and a professor pokes holes in what seems so obviously true to them growing up in their Christian upbringing. And now they have no way to come back. They don't have an adaptable faith. And so for me, broadening the spectrum of people that I was listening to and reading more than just one perspective on things helps you realize that there's kind of a robust school of thought from lots of different thinkers and perspectives on things, and everything isn't quite so cut and dried and black and white, but it's like, oh, so this guy who loves Jesus takes this view, and this guy who also loves Jesus takes this view. There's distinction here. Not everybody is exactly the same. For me, there's comfort in that, actually. Because when it's really rigid, you can break it pretty easily. But when it's a little adaptable, when we go, I did believe this, but maybe it's a little bit more like this. And I'm not talking about holding loosely like the integrity of the scriptures or the divinity of Jesus. These are not things that I'm talking about. Hey, read broadly and find out if maybe you think Jesus is, was Messiah and was who he said he was or not. Like those are really deep, serious questions. But I'm just saying within kind of what would be secondary issues and tertiary issues within the Christian faith, well, like the question that you just asked on evil and suffering, well, there's different answers depending on who you talk to. I don't know, for me, broadening the scope of what I was listening to and reading was very helpful.
Biggest pain in my life was losing my father at 51, who was a Christian, a pastor, a preacher. And just like that, he was gone. Whether you're a follower of Christ or not, there's pain.
Right.
And what are we supposed to do with that?
I think pain can be, it's not always, but it can be, I think, one of God's greatest tools to work for our good and his glory in our lives. Every follower of Christ is going to experience pain in one way or the other, not just because we live in a broken, fallen, sinful world, but I think also God leads us along a path of pain to a certain extent. There's an interesting story where the mother of James and John comes to Jesus. So these are two disciples of Jesus, and she comes to him and says, hey, when you come into your kingdom, could my sons could one sit on your right hand and one on your left? These are positions of authority is what she's asking for. And I can envision, this Jewish woman sees all of this potential in her sons. And it's like, there's so much. They could do so much. I could just hear her pleading, they've got so much promise. Look at them, Jesus. Could they do this? And Jesus' response is really interesting. He says, you don't know what you're asking. He says, can you drink the cup that I am about to drink? When he's speaking of the cup, he's speaking of his suffering. He was going to the cross. And we know from when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, he prayed and asked his Father, let this cup pass before me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but you will. The cup was the idea of suffering and what he was about to go through, what he was about to endure on the cross. So when he's turning to James and John and to their mother, he's saying, can you endure the suffering that I'm going to endure? In another place, Jesus says, if anyone would come after me, he's got to deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. In other words, part of the experience of following Jesus means there's going to be a cross, a cup involved that you have to drink. And what that means is that there's certain aspects of denying yourself, of transformation that are required, that are painful. Growth requires change, and change requires loss, and loss will always lead to pain. Therefore, growth and pain are connected. And anybody that, you've ever tried to establish a new habit or get rid of a habit or an addiction that you didn't want to have in your life, you understand the pain of that. It's not easy. And so when Jesus says, can you drink the cup? It means that in order to realize your potential, in order to be who I want you to be, and honestly, who you want to be, there is a process of pain that's required. It's going to mean letting go of some things. It's going to mean walking away from some stuff that's not helpful to you. It's going to mean learning some lessons that aren't easy to learn, but that pain will produce a fruit. Hebrews 12 says that all discipline is painful for a season, but in the end, it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness. In other words, in order for you to become who God wants you to be, there's pain involved in that. I think so for any Christian, we have to take Jesus' words seriously. Once he said, if you're going to follow me, anybody who'd be my disciple, you need to count the cost. You need to understand that there's a cost associated with following me. And if you don't get that going in, years ago, I determined to do P90X. I never really worked out hard in my life. And so I was like, I'm going to do P90X. I was so glad that I watched like all these videos before I did it to kind of prepare myself. And I read testimonials and I heard people talk about how brutally difficult it was, so that the first day when I went into this workout, that, not having really worked out in my life, I knew that it was going to be awful. Just that preparation and knowing that this is going to be really tough kind of helped me stay with it and gave me the resolve to continue. And so I think that's part of it. I think we do people a disservice when we say, hey, follow Jesus, it will be easy. I do believe follow Jesus, it will be better. Just like doing P90X. Was it hard? Oh yeah. Was I better for it? Absolutely. It's like the pain of it was so worth it in the end. And so there's a difference between, good pain and bad pain, what you might call like pain and harm. And I think it's important that we kind of know what that is.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, like, what is a specific kind of pain? Like, what's an experience that either you've had or someone that you've talked to, a pain that they've gone through?
Well, I mean, I think about the pain of admitting that you have a problem. That can be painful. Yeah. I mean, I think about people who don't want to talk about their issues, the pain of your past that you'd rather not deal with. I've got someone in my life who's very dear to me, who has a really painful past, grew up with an abusive father, struggles with self-confidence today, struggles with depression, anxiety today, struggles with alcohol addiction today. And I see all of this potential in him. Like, there's so much good that could happen through him, but he's cut off at the knees because of the pain of his past. And I've literally sat at, breakfast with him, and he knows where it all stems from. Like, he knows where it comes from. But when we talk about, so let's deal with it, I'm not a counselor, but like, let's deal with it. He's just, through tears, he'll be like, I can't. It's too painful. My son, Elliot, was at the skate park this last week. I took him over to this place here in Tulsa called The Gathering Place. It's got this huge skate park, concrete skate park. And when I went to pick him up, he has a scooter that he rides over there. He really is pretty good at it. And he got in the car and he goes, "Dad, there was a mouse that was trapped down in the bowls." And so it's basically like an empty swimming pool, no water in it, that kind of thing. And, smooth concrete sides. This mouse could not get out. I don't know if it got washed down in there or what. And so he said, yeah, it was trapped and it couldn't get out. He said, so I tried to help it out. And I said, so what did you do? And he said, well, I got it on the deck of my scooter. I was like, are you picking this mouse up? He's like, no, I could get it onto the deck of my scooter. And he said, so then I would try to lift the mouse out of the pool, out of the bowl, and it would hop off every time before I could get to the top. And I said, wow, I could sense like a dad teaching moment. I said, why do you think it did that? And he said, because it thought something really bad was going to happen to it. I was like, yeah, what's the underlying motivation there? Fear. And that's, I think, what often happens when we get ourselves into a mess. I don't want to go see a counselor. I don't need to sit down with somebody. I don't want to change the way that I eat. Any of those things. Like I don't want to budget. I don't want to admit we have a financial, I don't even want to look at the credit card bill, right? It's like all of that are things, it's pain we'd rather not endure. The problem is without facing the pain, there can't really be growth. Anybody who tells you, hey, follow Jesus, it won't be painful, they're misleading you. Following Jesus will be painful, but it's pain for your good. Again, anybody that's worked out knows to be suspicious of a workout that's not hard. Like if you've ever done a workout and you're like, that was easy, I felt nothing. You're kind of like, I wonder if anything happened. Because you recognize the best workouts are the ones that leave you kind of dead on the floor at the end, where you're just like exhausted and you're laying there like that's the time where you go, man, that really did something. And that's how it is, I think, is when you go through something and you experience the pain of it. Now here's the other side of it. It's like just because you experience pain doesn't mean you'll grow. There's a lot of people who are living in pain and they're not growing at all.
Why?
But pain is I think you have a choice to how you're going to react to pain. So I would say respect pain. I would say embrace pain. So embracing pain is about recognizing that it's like a gym, like a workout facility. Earlier this year, last year, I guess, 2020, obviously being the crazy year that it was, there was a lot of pain for me. It was the hardest year of my life. Just as a pastor and having the criticism of feeling like you're disappointing people all the time and they're letting you know about it. And, no matter what choices you make, people are upset and frustrated with you. And there were points where I was just like, God, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't know if I want to, continue with this whole pastor thing. I'm done. But when it dawned on me that the pain that I was walking through was actually an opportunity for God to do something in me and that I could grow through it, then I learned to embrace it rather than fight it and run away from it. And I think a lot of people are living with continual pain, but they're not embracing it and leaning into it. And that's the thing. It's like they get up to kind of the shadow of the cross and then they run away. It's like the mouse jumping off the scooter. They have an opportunity to go, okay, do whatever it is you need to do. Take me wherever this needs to go. And that's the hardest part. But what we don't realize is that on the other side of that is resurrection and transformation. And so we end up stuck in a cycle of pain, which is not a good place to be.
If you follow, I don't know, Myers-Briggs or any Enneagram, this is going to make a lot of sense to you.
Or are you a 7?
I'm a 7.
Yeah, you don't want pain.
I don't want pain.
No. You want fun and good times.
My big question is, if you gave me a project, I'd be like, is this going to be fun for me?
Yeah, that's Heather. That's my wife. She's just her like high value for fun.
Yeah. And what my marriage has revealed to me, we just celebrated 10 years, is how there's good to it. I mean, the joy of the Lord is your strength, and I can bring some joy into the situation, but I will run from pain pretty easily, and I won't change if there's not a mirror facing me. So when you say embracing pain, I'm like, oh, I really don't want to do that. That's really hard. That is probably the scariest thing to me, to deal with pain like that, because I do trust Jesus. I do believe Jesus. It doesn't change the fact that I feel that way.
Sure. I think the question is, do you trust him with your pain?
I do. I do, but not all, of course not
always, and neither do I.
And it's like Timothy Keller, pastor up in New York, says, the older you get, the closer you follow Jesus, hopefully the faster you run to him.
Yeah.
In those moments.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're all after.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Yeah. And I think as I follow Jesus, the more I know him and the further I journey with him, the more willing I am to trust him. Whereas, early on in my life, I'd fight and hold back and try to kind of keep things for myself or in my way, then I would learn to turn and follow Jesus.
Which is the definition of faith biblically.
Absolutely.
Just that the more you follow Jesus and the more you watch his faithfulness,
right,
the more your faith is built up. So I'm looking. So my first question, if we were walking through something, I would be, what is on the other side? If I do this, what hope do I have to cling to?
I think the hope that you have to cling to is that potential or realized potential is on the other side. In other words, the you that you could be, the husband that you could be, the man that you could be, the father that you could be. There's a better you inside of you. You already know that. Me too. And so what would that look like? The thing is the only way to mine that out is through pain.
Yeah.
Because again, growth equals change equals loss, and loss equals pain. And some of the pain will be easier to bear and some of it's harder to bear. It's not always like smashing your hand with a hammer, but then there are certain times where you go, I don't know if I'll survive this. And I actually think the deeper the pain, the more transformational. I think when I think about Jesus, he suffered the most, but then the transformation on the other side of that is also the greatest.
Yeah.
And I think, the same thing is true for us. The people that we see that are willing to kind of go to the depths and really wrestle with their demons and give those over to Jesus and endure whatever pain that looks like for them are the ones that, on the other side of it, it's incredible how God uses them and what can happen. These are the stories. I think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and what he suffered in Nazi Germany, standing up against Hitler, and what it ultimately cost him. But then again, we're still reading about him today. It's like the pain is proportionate to the transformation to the potential that will be realized out of your choice to say, okay, God, I trust you with this pain.
I can see we have a friend, Lance Lang, whose story is preacher's kid, 50 pill a day habit he got to. I think that was in his early 20s. And when he found freedom from his addiction, he was able to open Hope is Alive, which I believe they just opened their 20th home.
Wow.
They're homes that recovering addicts can move into to help find freedom and be part of a community where they can find Jesus and life transformation. That's the example you're talking about, right?
And that's the thing about Jesus is that anytime Jesus saves you from something, and this is one of the most important things you can know about Jesus, is that the salvation that Jesus gives is not just, and I like to say this a lot, you're not just saved from something, you're saved for something. So it's not just negative, like subtraction, right? So 10 minus 5 equals 5. So it's not like you had your life and there was sin in your life. And then Jesus shows up and sin subtracted. Woo! Well, that's part of it. But there's also an addition that goes with that. There's something that gets added to you. And these would be spiritual gifts. This would be Jesus taking your life, using it for him. So this is why I think every follower of Jesus is a minister in some sense or another. We're called to, commissioned by God to preach the gospel, make disciples. That's not just for the professionals, that's for all of us. It's his story. The horrible things that he suffered are the things that we proclaim, then are the salvation of the people that hear them. And the same is true for us. So when I talk about my porn addiction or I talk about the crummy husband that I was, those are the stories that resonate with people and they go, oh, wow, there's hope for you, there's hope for me. That's what he does. He takes the pain of your past, he takes the junk that you wished you could get rid of, and he does deal with it, but then he transforms it into something to be used for ministry. So there's a positive on the other side of it. And that's the hope, is that when you allow him to work, he not only transforms you, but that transformation then becomes a benefit to everyone around you. So I like to think of it like this: like, who's going to win if you endure this pain?
Yeah.
Who's going to reap the benefits? Your wife, your daughter, your family, your coworkers. Here's the inverse of that is also true. Who's going to pay the price if you don't?
Yep.
Because they will.
If I'm in a situation and I'm like, I do want freedom from this, or I'm walking through a pain, but I don't know what to do. What do I do?
My first suggestion would be that you should pray and ask the Holy Spirit to give you a step. And it's probably going to look like talking to someone. It's almost certainly going to end up with you communicating with somebody else.
Yeah.
I mean, that's generally where it will go. But I think it's asking God, now what next? And what a step is something doable. Just a doable. It could be a phone call. It might be jumping in a small group. For us at Church on the Move, it could be getting into a Bible study, sitting down with a pastor, going to see a counselor, showing up at somebody and saying, I have a problem. I remember being 15, 16 years old and struggling with porn and didn't know how to get out of it. And I thought, what do I do? And somehow inside of me, I instinctively knew the only way out of this is to tell somebody.
Yeah.
That was the last thing I wanted to do, but I knew it was the only way out. And so I think if you get quiet and you just say, okay, God, I don't know what to do. Give me a step. I think he will. And then what do? Do you listen for a voice from heaven? I just think you look for, like, what's that sense? That's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Find the next right thing to do and do it.
I found a lot of times I'll think of something I could do. It'll pop back up again and again.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, not every time, but a lot of times that is the step.
Yep.
One of the beautiful parts of Blaine Bartel's book, Death by a Thousand Lies, is he talks about his addiction and how he over and over and over looked in the mirror and said, I'm done. And nothing changed until people knew.
Yeah. And that's where I would say negative emotion is never enough. A lot of us are in a spot. I can't tell you how many times I've walked by the mirror lately and just said, something's got to change. I need to drop about 20 lbs. Like I'm wanting to get in shape or whatever, like we've all been there. And then later that day, I'm eating out of a pint of ice cream. So it's like, negative emotion is just never enough. We have to have a plan and a kind of, this is what we're pursuing. I'm heading in a new direction. And that's why the church community is so valuable, because you're not just stopping this. I'm going to stop doing this. Right. It's not that. It's I'm becoming a different kind of person.
Yes.
I'm becoming an honest person. I'm becoming a faithful person. I'm becoming a healthy person. I'm becoming a secure person. That's what I'm doing. And so it's really changing your identity, which is what the New Testament is really all about. It's why it talks about followers of Jesus being in Christ. It's a new identity that you're taking on. And that's what's changed me. It's not that, Whit, stop losing your cool. Whit, stop looking at porn. It's that I'm becoming the kind of person who doesn't do those things anymore. I'm becoming the kind of person who's faithful to Jesus and faithful to my wife. I'm becoming the kind of person who loves God and loves his neighbor. So I'm more patient with other people. It's not really about what I want to do. Yeah. It's about who I want to become. So I'm becoming someone completely different.
There's a step, asking the Holy Spirit to guide you to a first step. Community is a big part of this.
Massive.
I mean, there's got to be accountability.
Right.
Correct. What does that look like for people? Especially if, a lot of people, we're a bit of an anomaly that we work with our friends and we're surrounded by a lot of our friends all the time. People who are on the same journey as us.
Yeah.
But a lot of people aren't.
Yeah. And it's a massive disadvantage. I mean, I think human beings were created for community. I think we were created to be in a community with other people. And so when we isolate ourselves, and I tell people this all the time in our church, I'm like, the chances of you following Jesus go up exponentially when you choose to do this, when you choose to follow him with other people. But I think the great lie is I can handle it by myself. And if you look underneath of that and go, well, why do I feel that way? I think the reason is because there's pride in there, or maybe fear.
Yeah.
Which is, I just don't want people to know that I'm in that much debt. I just don't want people to know what I looked at last night. I don't want people to know what the scale really says, right? It's like we hide those things. Basically, what we want to do is let me clean it up first and get it to a point where it's kind of manageable, and then I'll tell people about it. Like, let me lose 100 pounds first, and then I'll tell people, okay, and then we can, when I'm kind of in a more victorious place with everything. But I just don't think it works that way. I think we have to come in and go, I'm broken.
Hey, thanks for listening to this episode of our podcast. Spirit in Motion is a podcast from Church on the Move in Tulsa, Oklahoma. For more information, you can go to churchonthemove.com. We'll see you next time.